BioCentury This Week is brought to you by Icon Biotech. As a world-leading healthcare intelligence and clinical research organization dedicated to the needs of small and mid-sized biopharma companies, Icon Biotech helps biotech organizations meet their critical milestones and deliver data and evidence-based results to investors, large pharma partners, and regulatory authorities. Icon Biotech advances clinical research by offering integrated outsourced services and solutions delivered by dedicated biotech teams and management that understand the different pressures faced by biotechs in their drive to solve today's challenges without losing sight of their mission to deliver life-changing innovations tomorrow.
Biotech's 2024 class of Series A companies. Who invested in what, and what are the top innovations on the horizon? We discuss the trends found in BioCentury's annual analysis of this group of startups. Also on today's BioCentury This Week podcast, a look at BioCentury, Bay Helix, and McKinsey's fourth East-West Summit on the Arc of Innovation in Asia. That is coming up in March in Singapore, and we'll have takeaways from Washington editor Steve Usden's exit interview with FDA's Patrizia Cavazzoni, the former director of the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. I'm Jeff Cranmer. Joining me to discuss all of this are my colleagues
Simon Fishburne, editor-in-chief.
Selena Koch, executive editor.
Josh Berlin, head of business development and corporate alliances.
And Steve Usden, Washington editor.
Okay, 152 biotechs disclosed a Series A round last year, and altogether the group raised nearly $7 billion. Here with a closer look at the trends in last year's Series A raisers are Simone and Selena. Selena, I'll start with you. You were the first editor on our colleague Danielle Golovin's analysis here.
Yeah, well, this is now an annual analysis that we do, and it's meaty. There's a lot of stuff in there. To me, the heart of it is always our analysis of the technologies behind these companies, which we look for themes among them, clusters of activity, but maybe we will start with some of those numbers. So you gave the top line already, Jeff. So the overall level of activity, the number of Series A rounds, the aggregate raised is pretty similar last year to the year before. But what stood out were the mega rounds. So for this analysis, we defined those as raising 100 million or more. And the number of mega rounds doubled in 2024 versus 23. And 23 was pretty consistent with the 3 years before that. And then the amount raised was about 50% higher. And that was even excluding Zera Therapeutics, which launched with $1 billion last year, but that wasn't specifically categorized as A.
Yeah, I mean, I think the mega rounds is really interesting. Again, reiterating that mega round is $100 million or more, but here we're talking about Series A. You know, we've heard a lot about how this has been a difficult financing environment. We are absolutely segregating into haves and have-nots, where the haves exist on two fronts. One is money, having money, being able to raise that, but the other is having clinical data. Some of these Series A companies with the large rounds came from a theme that you'll be hearing a lot about, if you haven't already, the NewCo model. They've come out of Asia and they've been heavily capitalized. So there's a cluster of companies there. And Selena, let's talk a little bit about the areas and technologies that have drawn those large mega rounds.
Yeah, and I don't want to give the impression that only, Asian technologies are getting mega rounds.
I didn't mean to give that impression. It's only Asians. It's more like, they are actually competing in that space. Sorry, keep going.
Yeah, I think there are some specialist investors that still have raised really big funds. They need to invest it, and they want to get their companies, their picks, a nice long runway because of how hard it is to raise out there and go public and so forth. So I think that's also contributing. But yeah, so these technology clusters that we identified this year fall into four major buckets. There's nanoparticle delivery. So this is largely focused on getting those nanoparticles outside the liver. Car carrying immune cell therapies. I didn't say CAR T because they go beyond CAR T. Targeted protein degraders, so this renaissance in small molecules continues. And antibody drug conjugates will surprise nobody. There's also the mashup of targeted protein degraders and antibody drug conjugates to create antibody degrader conjugates showing up in the analysis. So I thought one of the interesting things, speaking of Asia, among these clusters, was that the CAR cell therapies, there was a cluster of 8 of those doing, next generation interesting things, and 5 of them were China-based biotechs. So it wasn't that long ago that you thought of, wasn't that long ago that you thought of China and you thought of generics. But after that, of course, it was antibody engineering expertise, and Western companies could shop there for good antibodies against established targets. And then that broadened out to antibodies against first-in-class targets, ADCs, bispecifics, these more advanced formats. And now we're seeing this cluster of activity and these cell therapies as well. So we all watched Legend's success with Carvykti, of course, but now there's this growing class of cell therapies over there behind it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very interesting across the board. I want to circle back to some of the numbers around the very large Series A rounds, more than $100 million, because what actually we saw in 2024 was a doubling of the number of rounds. So there were 23, and this isn't all venture rounds, this is just Series A. So there were 23 Series A's with more than $100 million compared with like 12 in 2023, a similar number in 2022 and the years before. So that was really a big jump. And I think that's interesting in the background of hearing how pressed financing has been this last year. So there's still money out there for this. Let me just say the average raised was 50% higher 2024 over 2023, and the number of rounds was doubled. One more point on that front is that there were also, a certain percentage of Series A extensions in the Asia Pacific region, which you can hear we've been focusing on a little bit. Maybe Josh will tell you why later in this episode. 30% of the Series A's from Asia Pacific were Series A extensions, compared with about 13 or 14% in each of the Americas and Europe. So, we're seeing some regional differences in the financings and the trends, but it is going to be interesting to see how that unfolds this year. So that's just on the finance side, but really when you dig into the data on the technologies that Selena talked about and where they're clustering in terms of indication, it's really interesting.
Yeah, so I had two takeaways from this. One from Washington, and everybody here talks about the IRA a lot. Small molecules are not dead. It's clear that there's still investment going on there. The other thing I found really interesting was looking at the therapeutic areas, and it's not surprising, cancer is number 1, but neurology number 2, autoimmune number 3, endocrine, inflammation, infectious diseases all clustered around about the same numbers. I found that quite interesting.
Me too. One, autoimmune rose to the ranks from previous years and surpassed what we're calling an endocrine metabolic category, which includes obesity, right? Everybody wants to be in obesity today, yet we're still seeing more activity in autoimmune disease, and infectious disease was way down on the list.
And neurology number 2, is that driven by the enthusiasm for Alzheimer's treatments now?
Well, here's the thing about neuroscience. So this is really neuroscience general. They're always coming in number 2. It's kind of a misconception that there isn't money going into neurosciences. There has been every single year that we've done this in related analyses, whether it's a broader venture, whether it's deal making, there's always a ton of activity. The problem in neurosciences is that nothing ever works. Yet they still manage them. The needs are there, and there's some really large markets. So it does fuel continued trying.
Yeah, that was what I was thinking about. The needs are enormous. The costs of doing clinical development there can be enormous, but we're not actually seeing the payoff on it so much.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing in neuro is that's really where you have to go a little deeper and see, are there new mechanisms? So you're right, there was a lot of activity, but as we know, for a long time, it was all around amyloid or old targets. And so the question is, are they trying new ones? And to your point, Steve, it takes an incredibly long time to know if it works. You can ask Karuna, but by BMS, how long it might take. And I think 20 plus years might feature in there somewhere.
I think you're seeing a bit, I mean, we don't go into it in this particular slide deck, so you won't find it there, but a lot of activity in rare neuro, actually, rare neurology.
It's really interesting, that we're seeing a lot of investment in rare neuro. And what I think will be even more interesting will be to see what happens to that investment if Congress doesn't reauthorize priority review vouchers, because I think a lot of the investment case, at least for the small companies in rare neurological disorders, is the possibility of getting a PRV.
That's absolutely true. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Jeff.
And I don't know, Selena, you might know, but those are worth what now? 150 million in terms of when these small companies can sell them?
Yeah, recent ones have gone for 150, and the longer it goes unauthorized, the higher that price is going to go, right?
Yeah.
That's a lot of companies about this during meetings at JP Morgan, and everybody was like, oh gosh, so many of these companies could not afford to do this without that possibility. But there was a lot of optimism that it would be reauthorized. It's just a matter of when.
And then there was a little bit of a mention of obesity there. I'm just looking at the top VCs by number of disclosed investments. As we know, often some of these rounds are not disclosed immediately, but Novo Holdings at 10 and Lilly at 6 in terms of the leaderboard. And obviously, there's a lot of obesity money flowing through those companies. Alexandria, who I feel like I haven't heard a ton about lately, very active at 9. And of course, RA Capital, the always busy VC up in Boston at 6. Lot of gems among the data here, so I invite our listeners to pour a nice cup of tea or beverage of your choice and spend a little time with this analysis. We'll drop a link into the show notes, and of course, as always, you can find it at BioCenturyPodcast.com. I'd like to bring in my colleague Josh Berlin now. He is a guest from time to time and usually around conference time, and we have several conferences that we're preparing for here at BioCentury. Next up is the BioCentury Bay Helix East-West Summit, and that will be in March in Singapore. And Josh, tell us a little bit about the program.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff, and thanks everyone for joining today. As Jeff mentioned, this is our 4th edition of the East-West Summit, March 3 to 5 in Singapore. It's in Singapore, but not only about Singapore. It's really about what we're calling Asia's emerging arc of innovation. That includes Singapore, China, Japan, Korea, even India and Australia. And this year's theme is how to globalize Asia innovation from cross-border licensing to the NewCo model. And if anyone was out at JP Morgan, like a few of us here on the podcast were, I thought it was one of, if not the hottest topics being discussed in San Francisco was this phenomenon we're seeing about accessing innovation out of China and Asia. And so it's really, really good timing if you had conversations during JP Morgan to come out to Asia with BioCentury, Bay Helix and McKinsey and our global network to continue those discussions. If you missed out on the discussions at JP Morgan, this is a great way to see it for yourself as well. And we'll have 2 events this year in Asia. We have the one I just mentioned. We'll also be back in October, late October, the 27th to 29th with our 12th China Healthcare Summit in Shanghai. So 2 great opportunities to be part of the discussion and to hopefully find potential partners and assets that are of interest to you. Great lineup coming up in Singapore. We got sort of a who's who of investors on the program, including Flagship, MPM, Brandon Capital, CBC, Novo Holdings, Temasek, EDBI, Ali Bridge, and a whole slew of others. Really looking forward to hearing, in particular, what some of the Western investors are thinking. We have many that are coming out, at least to our event, for the first time in Asia and Singapore. And so really interested in hearing what they're looking at in Asia and what they think Asia CEOs need to do and management teams need to do to attract Western investors. We'll also have a deal-making showcase session where we'll also look at this angle from the cross-border licensing perspective. I think that'll also be a really hot topic. We are still recruiting presenting companies, so we have a few slots left. Jeff, I know you're sort of leading the charge on that, but already I thought that you have quite a few great biotechs coming to Singapore to present, and still have a few more chances to join the program, right?
Yeah, we have quite a few companies. Everest Medicines, which is quite an interesting in-licensing and mRNA vaccine play, will be there. Hua Medicine, which is a diabetes company, will be on the list. And one that I'm really excited about is Paratus. That's the bat company, right? Steve, you wrote about those guys.
I did. It's quite amazing. It's stem cells from punctures from the wings of bats. In writing about that, I learned a tremendous amount about bats so that I bore friends and relatives no end talking about how amazing bats are. They really are amazing.
So, a lot more companies beyond that. You can go to, is it eastwestsummit.com, Josh?
BioCenturyEastWest.com. The China event I mentioned also at the end of October is BioCenturyChinaSummit.com. We'd love to have you out there. Still time to get involved. So please drop a note to Jeff or to Simone or me, and we'd be happy to tell you how to get involved with these events and with others as well that we have planned this year.
And hey, don't sleep on Europe. Coming up in May, we'll have the 25th BioEquity Europe. That will be in Belgium.
Correct. Yeah, that's in Bruges, Belgium. We're already seeing record interest in this. None of us can believe it's the 25th anniversary. I think a few of us can't believe we're even 25, let alone we have a conference that's 25. If you want to get involved with that event, just one quick plug, we are running a early bird special that expires on the end of day, January 31st. So it's bioequityeurope.com. We expect this event to sell out. It's sold out the last several years. And I know Simone and Selena and team are working on a really, really strong program. And if you're looking to network with VCs and CEOs, this is the event for you. So hope everyone will come out and experience the beautiful city of Bruges, Belgium with us.
Yeah, just a couple things. First of all, everybody has to do their homework and watch the movie in Bruges. And it is a very spectacularly beautiful little town. Can we call it a town? I don't know if it's a town.
It's a big town.
It's a city, big town. But actually, this conference really does sell out every single year, and people start talking to me about it. Actually, even as soon as the last one's finished. So this is one of those times when early bird rates is actually worth something, because if you wait, you will be paying more if you even get a seat.
Yeah, and we are working on a few pre-event networking excursions. That's really become a tradition at BioEquity. So as you could imagine, we're going to lean into some of our favorite Belgian themes, which includes beer and chocolate, as well as a great opportunity to take the canal tour in Bruges. So if you want in on that, also you need to register early. That certainly will sell out as well, these pre-event excursions.
Simone, any promise of Colin Farrell being on the program?
Oh, that would be good, wouldn't it? He hasn't written to me recently, but yeah, I'll get my people to talk to his people for sure.
Excellent. I'm sure he likes beer and chocolate. Okay, speaking of beer and chocolate, Steve, I hope you're well stocked in Washington so that you have some creature comforts as you digest just wave after wave of news affecting NIH and FDA with the new administration, various changes that are taking place. I know you've been working the phones. We'll get to that in a minute, but first up, you got to speak with Patrizia Cavazzoni, the former head of FDA's CDER, on her last day on the job. What were some of the takeaways from that conversation?
Well, it was really interesting. To use a cliche, she was unplugged. I've known Dr. Cavazzoni for, 5, 6, 7 years. Well, she's been at FDA, and she's always been extremely interesting, but also careful. She wasn't so careful when she was on the way out the door. She said some very interesting things. One of the things she talked about was her opinion that there's a need for a new standard for defining efficacy of ultra-rare diseases. She had an interesting and nuanced approach to what ultra rare means, you have to read the story. It's really a matrix of things that she was talking about, not just the prevalence of the disease. And one of the things she said, I kind of pushed back a little bit, and I said, well, look, if there's a different standard for approving ultra rare diseases, isn't there a concern that that's going to leak over into other areas of FDA and lower the standards across the board? And she said, no, it's the exact opposite. She said that right now, nobody knows where the guardrails are. Nobody knows what so-called regulatory flexibility means, and nobody knows exactly what kind of products it applies to and what kind of products it doesn't apply to. So in her view, if you have a very narrowly defined set of conditions for which this ultra rare standard would apply, then it would mean that for everything else, you'd have to use what people call the gold standard of approvals. She also talked about areas where, in her view, the regulations and the law haven't kept up with the science, and that's causing problems for patients. It's causing problems for companies that are trying to develop drugs and for the healthcare system as a whole. 3 areas in particular: complex generics, biosimilars, and compounding.
Well, that's all very interesting. And we've heard other people make similar comments, such as former CETA director, Janet Woodcock, that, Janet's gone and now Cavazzoni's gone. How do people still at FDA feel about some of these issues? Do we have any insight into that?
I think that there are mixed feelings about it. I know that Peter Marks, for example, on the issue of whether there should be a legal standard for ultra rare diseases, has said that at least for biologics, he doesn't think that there should be. It's interesting, though. Patricia Cavazzoni probably would have said exactly the same thing a month ago or 2 months ago also. A lot of the views on these things change depending on where people are, whether they're in or out of the agency. But I can tell you that, this is probably not top of mind for a lot of people at FDA right now. There's a tremendous amount of turmoil and anxiety there that's completely unrelated to these kinds of scientific or regulatory issues. And I think it's going to be some time before things settle down enough that people are thinking about these kinds of issues there.
Yeah, I want to jump in, Steve, because, as your DC neighbor, you and I, we also both know people at NIH. I want to jump to the NIH and the clampdown on communications there. And I have to tell you, I think that even though I really do think that there's probably a case for reconfiguring NIH and changing a lot of the issues there, and I'm not talking specifically about DEI, the way that this has been rolled out, it's possible that they will restore all of that in a short amount of time. I think one of your pieces indicated the 1st of February, maybe, or shortly thereafter for some communications being allowed. But what's actually going on is that people cannot present at conferences, they can't submit articles, and this is the basis of science. So there's a lot of consternation about that. Clearly, there's a strategy to make people want to leave, I think, actually, to make it an unpleasant place. Some will, some won't. But to me, what's astonishing about this is that you're just weakening this. And in so doing, you are strengthening the hand of people that this government thinks are adversaries, China, who are incredibly preeminent in science, and every other place in the world. And, this is the nature of science. It goes by conferences, it goes by publications, it goes by communication.
The level of disruption in this transition has been extraordinary. It's more like a government shutdown.
It really is, yeah.
So,
but with spikes.
Yeah, with spite, it seems that way. Some of the other things that I've been told about, there are situations at NIH where there's equipment that's worth multi-millions of dollars, that there are staff who have left or have been pushed out who maintain that equipment. And as a result of that, scientists aren't going to have access to it. And it's not clear when that kind of issue is going to be resolved because there's a hiring freeze, and that hiring freeze is going to last for some time. There are patients who are reporting on social media that they're not getting access to clinical trials at NIH-sponsored clinical trials at medical centers. All of this really begs the question of whether it's a botched transition, as I said, or is this just kind of a beginning of other kinds of assaults on the integrity of science and of NIH. That really remains to be seen. And the same kind of questions are playing out at FDA. So, like a communications freeze when a new administration comes in is normal, but this one is extraordinary. FDA officials who were scheduled to speak at scientific symposia had to cancel at the last minute. I know of 2 events that were FDA co-sponsored scientific events, and FDA staff had to pull out of them. There are FDA authors who are forced to pull peer-reviewed articles from publications. And again, these aren't about anything political. This is about,
And Steve,
about
I
science.
think the point is, and I know there's a lot of people, I've heard some people, I've heard the secondhand, actually, not firsthand, saying, it'll be fine. It's not going to affect everybody. That is probably true. And when the new NIH director comes in, maybe that person will, if it's Jay Bhattacharya, does know how science is done, same at FDA. But that's not the point, in a way, is that, there are a lot of people in NIH and FDA, I assume, who are sitting there saying, you and I can say we don't know what it's going to look like, but they have to say, do I want to take that gamble and stay, right? And new people are saying, should I really apply for that position? Do I really want to do biomedical research at NIH or FDA? Or am I just better off staying in Europe or going elsewhere? And so I think that the competitive angle on that and what it means for the agency long term and its preeminence in the world is something that hasn't really been thought through. It's hard to
and again, we don't know whether this is just a blip and whether things will revert back to some kind of a mean or not. But there are things that are troubling to people. One of the things also I would point out, so there's been this scrub of DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, by the way, has been added to it from FDA's website. It's being done in a very abrupt and really kind of brutal way. There are people who have had their jobs, who have had their livelihood, where they were mandated. Their job was to administer and run these kinds of programs. They've been sent home on administrative leave. They don't have access to FDA computers anymore or NIH computers. They don't have access to the buildings. And they're basically being treated like criminals, and they believe that they're going to be fired. There are FDA managers who part of their performance reviews, their annual performance reviews, was diversity in hiring at FDA. And now that's all being scrubbed out, and they're being actually going to feel that they're going to be punished for doing things that previous administrations, and by the way, much of this started during Trump's first administration, that they're being punished for doing things that they were actually being mandated to do in the past. But going forward, there are other issues. Okay, so there's two other issues on the immediate horizon.
Can I just jump in? So I want to make one point, just clarify one point, Steve. Maybe you could just lay out how much of this was across the whole federal government.
So the hiring freeze is across the whole government. Everyone in government, every government agency is being asked to compile lists of people who were hired over the last 2 years, presumably because it's easier to fire people under the law who have been there for 2 years or less. But there are other things that are specific to HHS, to NIH, FDA, CDC, and similar public health agencies. The communications ban was really is an HHS thing. One of the things, though, that people are worried about also going forward is how some of the other things that are also being applied across government are going to apply, for example, at FDA. One of the big ones is a mandate to end people working at home, to end hybrid work, and have everybody come into the office all the time. The concern at FDA, and this was raised at a CERSI meeting in San Francisco just before JP Morgan by former FDA Commissioner Scott Gottlieb, by former acting FDA Commissioner Janet Woodcock. They both said that, look, the telework policies at FDA have been in place for more than 20 years under Republicans and under Democrats. A lot of people have built their lives and they've built their careers at FDA around the possibility of flexible work. And in many cases, they've been willing to accept compensation that's less than what they would have gotten in the private sector because they have that flexibility at FDA. Now there's a concern that there won't be any kind of exceptions for FDA, that everyone at the agency will be required to show up and work 5 days a week. There aren't even desks and phones and computers and things like that to accommodate all of those people. And the concern is that the intention is to drive large numbers of people to leave. What former FDA Commissioner Scott Gottlieb has said is that if that happens, there's a very real possibility that FDA won't be able to meet its PDUFA goals and other user fee goals for product reviews. Again, that's all kind of in the future. It's really not at all clear that it's going to get to that level, but there are people who care deeply about public health, who care deeply about medical product development and know a lot about FDA, who say that these are worrying trends and that some things need to be taken relatively soon to ensure that there isn't a kind of permanent erosion in FDA's capabilities?
Well, Steve, hearing your report there, and I know you wrote about this to some degree in the most recent Perspective in our Editor's Perspective series on Friday. I will drop a link to that in the show notes. And we began talking about beer and chocolate. I'm beginning to think that beer may not be strong enough for you, sir. But in addition to what Danielle wrote on the Series A class from last year, Selena, what else do we have? I think we have Paul Bonanos giving his takeaways on deal trends, and that will be shaping up to come out.
And then we'll have an update from Lauren Martz on FDA's platform technology designation, how that might be evolving, what kinds of technologies may be in and out. I know everybody's hungry to get some information on that.
And Simone, are you cooking anything up?
Well, Jeff, I am cooking a few things up, but in addition to that, I'm working a lot on the upcoming East-West conference, and in fact, already starting to work on our Grand Rounds conference. We're going to have 2 this year, and the first is in Chicago, right after ASCO, June 3rd to 5th. You heard it here first. And even after this podcast, we will be discussing the agenda of that. So that's our translational conference, away from politics and into the deep science, which is our happy place.
And coming up this week, speaking of our happy place of science-y stuff, we will have a special edition of the BioCentury This Week podcast with special guest Peter Schuler, who is SVP of Drug Development Services, CNS, at ICON. We will be hearing his takeaways from the ECNP workshop. It is a roadmap meeting on precision psychiatry that took place last week in Frankfurt. And we'll also use the occasion to check in with Selena on some of her takeaways from the various neuro conversations she was having at JP Morgan. Okay, so we'll catch you Thursday, and a special thanks to Cole Travis, our production guru extraordinaire, and of course Kendall Square Orchestra, which provides the music for our podcast. The group connects science and technology professionals and other members of the greater Boston community to collaborate, innovate, and inspire through music while supporting causes related to healthcare and education.
BioCentury would like to thank Icon Biotech for supporting the BioCentury This Week podcast. To learn more about how Icon Biotech can help you meet your critical milestones, go to iconplc.com/biotech.